What's going on, everyone? Mr. Cameron here, and today we are going to be talking about African Americans in the Civil War. Now, this is such a big topic, and it's so complex, and there's so much information that it is impossible for me to cover everything in a 5 to 10 minute video. And really, it's impossible to cover it in several weeks. But what we're going to do is we're going to hit the highlights today. We're going to look at, in my opinion, the two biggest things to happen to African Americans, or two of the biggest things, I should say, to happen to African Americans in the American Civil War. And those two things that we're going to look at are, number one, the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll talk about here in a second. And then number two, we're going to talk about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was an infantry regiment that actually did some fighting in the American Civil War. So as always, follow along with me, and I'll show you exactly what you need to do in order to complete this lesson. As always, guys, you will want to navigate to your class notebook, and then in class notes, you will see that there is a section called African Americans in the Civil War. Now, a couple questions that we need to consider here are, number one, what role did African Americans play in the Civil War? Number two, how did the role of African Americans change throughout the war? And then number three, how might this role change depending on where you lived? Because we are going to look at African Americans in the South during the Civil War, and also African Americans in the North during the Civil War. And as you'll see in the reading and in the videos, your life during the Civil War, if you're African American, would vary widely depending on where exactly you lived. So if you follow along with me here, you'll see that 1863 was a very important year for African Americans in both the North and the South. Because in 1863, Abraham Lincoln is going to issue his very famous Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what the Emancipation Proclamation does is it frees all African Americans that were slaves in the Confederate States of America. Now, this is both good and bad in 1863. It's good because it's a huge step closer to abolishing slavery throughout the entire United States of America. It's bad because the Confederate States don't look at Abraham Lincoln as their president. So this is largely symbolic because Lincoln, of course, as we know and as we've been talking about, is the president of the United States of America. But the Confederate States of America do not look at Lincoln as their president. That's why they seceded and started their own nation. So while this is great and it's very symbolic, many Confederate states just simply ignored Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what this does mean, though, is that if any runaway slaves or African Americans in the South can make it to Union lines, then they will be put toward fighting against the Confederacy, and they'll be able to help out in the war effort, whether that's helping to fortify Union fighting positions, whether it's helping to get supplies, whether it's helping with whatever job the Union Army needs. That's something that African Americans can do if they're able to make it to Union lines. Now, as I mentioned, the Emancipation Proclamation, it applies to states in the Confederacy. What it does not apply to are those border states that we'll talk about a little bit more, and those are states that still allow slavery, but they don't join the Confederacy. They stay loyal to Abraham Lincoln and the North. So in states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, they're still a part of the Union, but slavery is still legal there. And this is really a strategic move by Abraham Lincoln because he needs those border states to stay on his side. If he tries to abolish slavery in those border states will get angry, they will join the Confederacy, and it will make the war a lot harder to win. So as you go through this section and you read through this just short little paragraph here, I want you to click on this and watch this video called Emancipation Proclamation and African American Soldiers in the Civil War, and it will take you through a lot of those things that I just talked about. Again, the Emancipation Proclamation will free those slaves in the South, in the Confederate States. It does not apply to those border states just yet, and slavery will be abolished in those states and throughout the entire country with the passing of the 13th Amendment after the war. The other thing that we're going to talk about today is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And you can see there's a picture right here, and I'll read right from this caption. Pictured here to the left is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This unit, which was made up mostly of African American soldiers, was one of the first African American regiments created during the Civil War. Formed in 1863, the 54th Massachusetts saw combat throughout the rest of the war. Now, this is perhaps the most famous African American infantry regiment. So these were African Americans, mainly freeborn black soldiers from the North, but some that did fight in the war had started off as slaves. But for the most part, they were free blacks that had lived in the North. But they are going to join the Union Army, and they are going to fight heroically and bravely against the Confederacy. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, if you were a white soldier and you were captured by the Confederacy, you may be treated relatively humanely. You'd still be sent to a prisoner of war camp, which had terrible conditions, but oftentimes you would be allowed to live. If you're an African American soldier and you were fighting for the Union and you were captured by the Confederacy, there was a much worse fate that could be awaiting you. Some African American soldiers might be killed right away. Some African American soldiers might be sold and sent down into slavery in the South. So this is why you start to hear about so many African American soldiers fighting so bravely throughout the war, because really they're fighting for freedom, and the freedom that they're fighting for takes on additional meaning, because keep in mind, we've been talking about slavery throughout the entire last chapter. So they are fighting for freedom, not only for themselves, but for so many African Americans throughout the country. And they knew that they couldn't just surrender and be treated the same as white soldiers. So many black soldiers fought incredibly hard because they knew that was their only option. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to read this short history of African American soldiers in the war. And then if you come down here, there's a short 4-minute video that's on the 54th Massachusetts. Now, once you're done with all that, I want you to go ahead and answer these questions. Again, why was 1863 an important year for African Americans, keeping in mind what the Emancipation Proclamation was and what it did? The second question, what did the Emancipation Proclamation do for African Americans in both the North and the South? In the South, it freed those slaves, but keeping in mind that the Confederacy did not look at Lincoln as their president, although it was a very symbolic gesture. But in the North, it gives African Americans the chance to fight for the Union Army. Leading into that, the third question is, what was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment? And then finally, how did their role in the war help both the Union Army and the African American community? Now, I don't know if you guys learned about this last year, but there were African Americans fighting for the United States all the way back to the Revolution in 1776. There were actually black soldiers from Rhode Island that were allowed to serve, and they fought very bravely, especially in the Yorktown campaign. But this is a chance for African Americans to fight to end slavery, a chance to improve their status in the United States. And so many African Americans were very proud to have that opportunity. All right, guys, I know this is a very kind of quick rundown of what I want you to do. And the story of black soldiers in the Civil War is a story of bravery. It's a story that is extremely encouraging. It's a story that this short 5 to 10 minute video just does not do justice to. And we'll talk more about this in the coming classes in the coming days and weeks. But this is a good overview on those two big events in 1863. Number one, the Emancipation Proclamation, and number two, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment and those African American soldiers that were fighting for freedom, fighting for the Union Army, and fighting to get rid of slavery throughout the United States. So hopefully you guys found this informative. Hopefully you've learned a little bit from this video. Make sure that you guys do the readings, make sure that you watch the videos, and definitely make sure that you answer those questions at the end there. All right, guys, if you have questions, as always, make sure that you reach out, and hopefully you liked the lesson today. Hopefully you learned something, and I look forward to seeing you all either in person or online in the days and weeks ahead. All right, guys, thanks.